Thank you. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Chairman, thank you again for being here. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the federal government will spend an average of $545 billion per year, which was the estimate before rates went up. And these are on interest payments on the $31 trillion of national debt. So that's $545 billion is more than we spend on the Department of Veterans Affairs. So given that the national debt is currently at about 125% of GDP, with the Fed's commitment to tackle inflation, would that be limited by rising interest rates, making the servicing of the national debt even more expensive?
No, absolutely not.
Explain that.
No, we are, we're not in a situation where we need to consider fiscal questions like that. The U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path, meaning the debt is growing faster than the economy, but it's not in an unsustainable position. We can service our debt, and the markets understand that, and we can conduct our policy without thinking about questions of fiscal sustainability, and we do.
When your colleague, Secretary Yellen, was before this committee, she told me that federal debt, which was then about 105% of GDP, she said, quote, "That's not a number that I think is fiscally irresponsible." She also went on to say, quote, "If interest rates are zero, we could substantially have a higher debt burden." And in the formula in the following questions, she alluded to Japan and the fact that it could be about double of where we are now, meaning about $60 trillion of debt if you use her math. So do you agree with Secretary Yellen that having a national debt of over 100% of GDP is fiscally responsible, given that interest rates can change and that historically low interest rates can't always be expected?
I guess I would say it this way. We're not on a sustainable path, and we haven't been for some time. And that means that simply the debt's growing faster than the economy. By definition, that is unsustainable. There will be a point at which it becomes a problem of servicing the debt. We're not at that point. We're not close to that point. But we will need to get back where revenues and spending are better aligned. We don't need to pay the debt down. We just need to have the economy growing as fast or faster than the economy over a long period of time, and we must do that. I wouldn't say any particular level. There is no level that I can point to where there's a lot of science behind it being a problem, but we know that the path is not sustainable.
It's interesting that you allude to growth being part of the solution. I want to talk about regulation for a minute, particularly since the Biden administration delayed oil and gas lease sales again this week due to environmental protests. So if we pursued policies to increase American energy production by approving more leases and building more pipelines to transfer that energy and cut down on regulatory barriers to make it easier for folks to produce energy and produce anything, wouldn't that make a real impact on energy prices and inflation in general without us needing to use the Fed to slow the economy with monetary policy to deal with inflation?
So these questions of the whole set of questions around energy are really questions for elected people. We don't have a mandate there. Obviously, the more supply there is, the price of something can go down. But these are trade-offs that you really have to weigh as elected officials, rather than.
I'll narrow it just for a minute. Do you believe that the vast amount of regulation is an impediment to economic growth?
I will say this: we try hard at the Fed to weigh the costs and benefits of regulation, and we do think it's important to think about it that way, because there are benefits to regulation, but there are costs, and we don't want the costs to be any higher than they need to be, because that does weigh on economic activity. Yes.
I mean, when you talk about somebody trying to buy a home and now they're questioning it because of the rise in mortgage rates, and then I hear for years that the 25% of the cost of a new home is due to regulation at some level. So that's the point I'm trying to make, is that we need to be very cautious with our regulations, because a lot of it's constraining our growth, and the growth ultimately which solves this fiscal problem. So the point I'm trying to make is that we have much better tools like deregulation, which can free up supply, rather than just monetary policy. And freeing up supply could largely solve the inflation problem for hardworking Americans and not send us into a recession. So again, I thank you for being here, and Chairwoman, I yield back.